This part of the session is being run by Emma Whipday, who I'll hand over to in a moment. But before I do, I just want to introduce her and Professor Laura Gowing, who's her co-conspirator, I guess, in this part of events. So Laura Gowing is Professor of Early Modern English History at King's College London, and she's published extensively on how legal records illuminate the lives of women in early modern England. Her publications include Domestic Dangers, Women, Words and Sex in Early Modern London, which won the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women Award for Best Book 1996. She's currently working on women and the City of London companies in the 17th century. And Emma Whipday, who I'll hand over to in a moment, is a teaching fellow here at King's in Shakespeare and Early Modern Literature. She's also a Globe Education lecturer at Shakespeare's Globe. She studied English at Oxford and has an MA and PhD from UCL, and she's taught at UCL, the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, and Brasenose College, Oxford. And collaborating with her and Laura and Lena for this part of the afternoon are four actors, George Johnson, Remy Milner, Andy Merton, and Beth Eyre. And I'll hand you over to Emma.
Thank you, and thank you, Lucy. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second half of this event, which is the performance workshop. So I'm delighted to welcome back Lena and to welcome Laura, and we'll be drawing on their expertise in a moment, and also to welcome the four actors. The way this format is going to work is that each of the speakers will introduce a particular court case that will be brought to life by the actors, and then you'll see that court case in performance. Both of them draw on themes and ideas of marriage and what happens when marriage contracts or dowries go wrong, and one of them features Shakespeare and the other one doesn't. And so what we're going to be looking at is two sort of different strands in our investigation or workshop this afternoon. One is what happens when we put something that involves Shakespeare and is an archival record we can explore next to an archival record that doesn't involve Shakespeare. Do we look at them differently? Do we learn things from the interplay between the two? And the other thing we're going to be exploring is what happens when we put records that we normally examine on the page in performance, particularly when some of these records have already been performed in some sense. So some of the records we'll be looking at, people have spoken them aloud and then they've been recorded and written down, and we're trying to bring those written records whilst being aware that various processes will have happened in how they were transcribed, the legalese used that would have lost some of the original speech. We're trying in some sense to bring that back to life. So that's what we'll be exploring. After that exploration, there will be a roundtable discussion, which you are very much invited to participate in. So I know it would be difficult to fit all of you around a table, but if you could imagine that you are also part of this table, and we've got our roving mics, and you'll be invited to ask questions or contribute any thoughts or comments, both to the two speakers, and also if you want to ask anything of the actors and what their experience of working with early modern literary texts in the past or with contemporary verbatim theatre has brought to this very particular kind of early modern verbatim theatre we're putting together today. So I hope you enjoy it. Please do keep any questions or comments in mind for that final roundtable section. And now I will pass on to Lena for the first court case.
Thanks. If you've read the Charles Nicholl book, The Lodger, Shakespeare and Silver Street, then you're familiar with this 1612 case, Stephen Ballot versus Christopher Montjoy. It was just a dispute that was conducted in the Court of Requests. We know about this case because of two American bardologists, Charles William Wallace and his wife Huldah, who came to the Public Record Office on Chancery Lane, just absolutely convinced that if they beat enough bushes, good things would fly out. And they went through every grimy and under-cataloged document they could find. Their principal find was this court case in which Shakespeare appeared as a witness. It's interesting to consider this case in the light of the will, because even despite his great archival triumph, Charles Wallace was disappointed. It was so much less than we had wished. The juxtaposition is also interesting because between them, the will and the deposition contain 4 of the 6 confirmed signatures of Shakespeare. Both the will and the deposition in some way represent his speaking voice, although in both cases the voice is highly mediated, with his lawyer Francis Collins performing some legal translations in the will, and with the court scribe repackaging the deposition that was presented in court. Stephen Ballot, the complainant, was in succession Christopher Mountjoy's apprentice. His son-in-law, he apprenticed, by the way, as a tire maker or a maker of ornamental headgear. So he was his apprentice, then his son-in-law, next his business partner, and finally his accuser in court. And this is a case of he said back, he said again. And then the officers of the court called in witnesses who said, I heard him say this, I heard him say that. Myself, I don't really know personally about this or that. There are differences about exactly how Shakespeare got involved in this case, but everybody agrees that he served as matchmaker for the young couple Stephen Ballot and William Mountjoy back in 1603 or 1604. The deposition, by the way, ends with him making clear that he's really not interested in household goods. So that's something to watch for. Thanks to our actors and to Emma, we have the chance to adjudicate the case for ourselves today. Thanks.
To the King's most excellent majesty, in all humbleness complaining, showeth unto your most excellent majesty, your highness's poor and faithful and obedient supplicant, Stephen Ballot of London, tire maker. About 9 years past, being then a servant unto Christopher Mountjoy of London, tire maker, I did well carry and behave myself in the time of my service, both justly and to the great profit and advantage of Master Mountjoy. I, in all outward appearance, did obtain the goodwill and affection of him, in such sort as he offered unto me, that if I would accept in marriage Mary Mountjoy, being his daughter and only child, that he would give in marriage with his daughter the sum of £60, or thereabouts, for a portion upon my day of marriage or shortly after, and would likewise, at the time of his decease, leave unto his daughter and I the sum of £200 more. Upon which offers, and upon his persuasions, I did shortly after intermarry with Mary, and have lived together these 5 years, and have had diverse children betwixt us, to the great increase of our charge, and are likely to have many more, so that our poor trade is not able to give us maintenance. And I lent Christopher the sum of 40 shillings, which he denies to pay, or to perform his former promise. But so it is. May it please your most excellent majesty, that I, growing since my marriage with Mary into some want and necessity, I therefore repaired unto Christopher, desiring him to satisfy and pay unto me the sum of £60, so promised by him unto me. Also to put into sureties to leave his wife and I £200 upon his death. Who altogether forgetting his fatherly promises, nor pitying the distressed poor estate of your poor subject, very unnaturally doth not only now deny his promise and refuse to pay the said sum of £60, but likewise denieth the payment of the sum of 40 shillings so lent him. And also have since given forth divers times to divers persons that he intendeth not to leave unto your supplicant, his wife nor children, the value of 1 penny whensoever he shall depart this natural life, being not only to the great loss and hindrance of your supplicant, his wife and family, but also to their utter undoing, if they be not relieved by the justice of this honourable court, and being a man of good estate and without charge. By the strict course of the commons laws of this realm, your poor subject is remediless, either to recover the £60 so promised, or to compel Christopher Mountjoy to put in sureties to leave £200 to your highness poor subject and his wife at his death, being of late inclined to waste his estate. For that your loyal subject cannot prove the promise in so strict manner as by the common law is required, neither is your loyal subject able to prove the loan of the 40 shillings. Your subject, your Highness most gracious, your subject may be able to prove the loan of the 40 shillings to Christopher Mountjoy. May it therefore please your Highness to grant unto your subject your Highness most gracious writ of privy seal, to be directed unto the said Christopher Mountjoy, commanding him thereby at a certain day, and under a certain pain therein, to be directed personally to appear before your Highness in your Highness Court of Whitehall, commonly called the Court of Request, then and there to make a direct answer to the premises, and to stand to such further order and direction therein as by your Highness or your said council shall be thought meet, to stand with equity and good conscience. And your said loyal subject, according to his bounden duty, shall heartily pray to God to prolong your Highness' happy reign and life long to continue.
The answer of Christopher Mountjoy to the bill of complaint of Stephen Bellott, complainant. About 10 years last past, I was contented at the entreaty of Stephen Bellott's friends to accept him to serve me as apprentice to learn in my trade, being a tire maker. Stephen's friends promising to find him convenient apparel while he should so continue in my service. And Stephen did serve me as apprentice 6 years or thereabouts, but during all the time of his service, neither Stephen nor any of his friends did, according to their promise, find him any apparel at all, saving linen. But I was enforced to find him all the residue of his apparel during all the said time. Neither had Stephen, during all the time of 6 years, any further or other relief or other maintenance from his friends, but was during all the said time wholly and solely maintained by me. And after Stephen had served me 6 years, he was desirous to travel into Spain. And I did furnish him with money and other necessaries for the journey to the value of £6 or thereabouts. After which time Stephen returned from his travel and was a suitor unto my daughter to marry her, and to that purpose did move me and my wife for our consents for the marriage, and we, being poor and able to bestow little or nothing with our daughter in marriage, save that I had then brought her to a good perfection in my trade of tire making, were contented to yield, though Stephen neither then nor ever since, to my knowledge, had any money or other valuable goods or lands whatsoever from his friends, nor any other things whatsoever. But what he had gotten in my service, and by the trade that I had learned him. And afterwards, about 5 years past, Stephen was married to my daughter, at which it was agreed between us that if Stephen with his wife should continue and work in their trade to my benefit, during the space of 2 years after the said marriage, giving them house room and diet convenient to them, then I, at the end of 2 years, would give Stephen £50 or to that effect, and they did for a little time remain in my house accordingly. But after he and his wife had stayed the space of half a year or thereabouts, he refused to stay there any longer, and would take needs to take other courses for his better preferment, as he then pretended. And when Stephen did depart from my house, I, out of my love to Stephen and his wife, being no other way compellable thereunto, did bestow on them a good proportion of household stuff, and the things concerning their trade according to my ability, being to the value of £20 or thereabouts, and likewise £10 of ready money to put into their purse, and did heartily desire their welfare, and likewise did intend to leave unto Stephen and his wife, being my only child, all or the most part of that estate which God should have blessed me with at the time of my death. And so in my fatherly love, to have them been helpful to them from time to time according to my poor ability. After Stephen was gone from my house about a year, my wife died. And then Stephen and his wife came again and lived with me as partners in our trade of tiring, about the space of half a year, during which time I had in my hands the sum of 40 shillings of Stephen's money. And at the time Stephen's departure from my house, Stephen, being indebted unto a brewer the sum of £3, desired me to pay it for him, which I did accordingly. But I was never since repaid the £3, or any part thereof, other than the 40 shillings as aforesaid. And during the half year Stephen was with me, I did buy into the shop with my own money silvered wire and other commodities concerning our trade to the value of £10 or thereabouts, for which Stephen should, by agreement, have paid half, but did pay never a penny. And I absolutely deny that I did ever, to my knowledge, offer unto Stephen in marriage with my daughter the sum of £60, or any proportion of other sum whatsoever, other than the sum of £50 at the end of 3 years. And likewise, I deny that I ever did promise to leave Stephen and his wife at my death the sum of £200, or any other certain sum, but did intend to deal with Stephen and his wife at the time of my death, the only child, but I neither then could or not yet set down any certainty thereof, for that I both then was and yet am a poor man. And I know not how it will please God to bless me in my estate at the time of my death, nor how Stephen and his wife will behave themselves towards me in my lifetime, whereby they may deserve my affection and love towards them. And likewise, I deny that, to my knowledge, do owe the complainant 40 shillings or any other former sum of money whatsoever. I did, about a month since, earnestly request Stephen, in the presence of his neighbours, to account with me for the reckoning between us, at which time he did give me ill languages, and bid me come by my money how I could. All which matters I am ready to aver and prove, as this most honourable court shall award, and I humbly pray to be dismissed out of the same.
The replication of Stephen Belloc to the answer of Christopher Mountjoy. I, not confessing or acknowledging any matter in Christopher Mountjoy's answer to be true in such sort, manner or form, say that the said answer is, in all, or the most part, untrue, uncertain and insufficient to be replied unto. I do and will aver, maintain, justify and prove my said bill of complaint and every matter, article and allegation therein contained to be true, certain and sufficient to be answered unto, set forth and declared. That my friends at the time of my coming to be apprentice with Christopher did promise to find me convenient apparel, or that Christopher at the time of my travel into Spain did furnish me with £6 or with any other sum of money, is untrue, as I was furnished by myself, and that I did move Christopher or his wife for their consents to the marriage of Mary is untrue, but I was only drawn thereunto by Christopher, and that I received any goods or household stuff or Christopher or any things concerning their trade, or desired Christopher to pay the sum of £3 or any other sum to the brewer as alleged, is untrue, and that I was desired by Christopher to come to any account, or gave Christopher any ill language, as is alleged, is untrue. All and every which matters I am ready to aver, justify, maintain and prove, as this honourable court shall award, and humbly pray, as I pray before my bill of complaint have already prayed.
The rejoinder of Christopher Mountjoy, defendant, to the replication of Stephen Belloc, complainant. I, not acknowledging anything in the replication material alleged to be true in such sort, for rejoinder thereunto, say in all things as in my answer I have said, and do will aver, maintain and prove my said answer and every matter, article and thing therein contained to be true. I will maintain and prove that Stephen's friends did promise to find Stephen apparel, as in my answer is affirmed, and that I did furnish Stephen with money at the time of his travels into Spain, and that I and thy then wife were moved and earnestly solicited by Stephen to consent to his marriage of our daughter, and Stephen not drawn thereunto by me, and that I did give unto Stephen household stuff and other goods, and was also desired by Stephen to pay unto the brewer £3 for Stephen's debt, and paid it as in my answer is likewise and most truly affirmed.
Deposition of Joan Johnson, the wife of Thomas Johnson, of the parish of Ealing in the county of Middlesex, basket maker, of the age of 40 years or thereabouts. I know Stephen Bellot, and have known him about 8 years, and Christopher Mountjoy about 8 years. I did know Stephen when he served Master Mountjoy, and he behaved himself well, and in good sort, when he served him, for I was a servant to Master Mountjoy that time. But I never heard him confess and say that he had great profit and commodity by Stephen's service. Master Mountjoy seemed to bear great goodwill and affection towards Stephen when he served him, giving him report to be a very good servant for plying his service. But that Master Mountjoy moved Stephen to marry with his daughter Mary, I know not. There was a show of goodwill between Stephen and defendant's daughter Mary, which the defendant's wife did give countenance unto and think well of. And as I remember, Master Mountjoy did send and persuade one Master Shakespeare that lay in the house to persuade Stephen to the same marriage. But more I cannot depose. I never heard my master, the defendant, proffer Stephen any sum of money in marriage with his daughter Mary. But it was reported in the house that Stephen was to have with her in marriage the sum of £50. What time of payment was thereof appointed or agreed upon, I know not, nor of any promise of any other or further portion to be paid Stephen, either at the time of marriage, between them, or at the time of my master's decease. But they after married together, and more I cannot depose. I know not what parcels of goods and household stuff Master Mountjoy promised to give unto Stephen in marriage with his wife, but Master Mountjoy gave in marriage with her to Stephen several parcels of good. The value of them I certainly know not, but I think they were worth some £8 or thereabouts, and more I cannot depose.
Deposition of William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon in the county of Warwick, gentleman of the age of 48 years or thereabouts. I know the parties, plaintiff and defendant, and have known them both, as I now remember, for the space of 10 years or thereabouts. I did know Stephen Bellot when he was servant with Christopher Mountjoy, and that during the time of his service with the said defendant, he, Stephen, to my knowledge, did well and honestly behave himself. But, to my remembrance, I have not heard Christopher confess that he had got any great profit and commodity by the service of Stephen. But I verily think that Stephen was a very good and industrious servant in the said service. It did evidently appear that Christopher Mountjoy did, all the time of Stephen Bellot's service, with him bear and show great goodwill and affection towards him. I have heard Christopher and his wife divers and sundry times say and report that Stephen was a very honest fellow, and that Christopher did make a motion that Stephen to Stephen of marriage with Mary in the bill mentioned, being his sole child and daughter, and willingly offered to perform the same if Stephen should seem to be content and well like thereof. Further, the defendant's wife did solicit and entreat me to move and persuade Stephen to effect the said marriage, and accordingly I did move and persuade him thereunto. And more to this interrogatory I cannot depose. Master Mountjoy promised to give the Stephen a portion in marriage with Mary, his daughter, but what certain portion I remember not, nor when to be paid, nor know that Master Mountjoy promised Stephen £200 with his daughter, Mary, at the time of his decease. But I say that Stephen was dwelling with Master Mountjoy in his house, and they had amongst themselves many conferences about their marriage, which afterwards was consummated and solemnized. And more I cannot depose. I can say nothing touching any part or point of the question of household stuff, for I know not what implements and necessaries of household stuff the defendant gave the plaintiff in marriage with his daughter Mary.
Can you hear me? Yes? No? Better? Okay, so in counterposition to the case you've just heard is another one from a different legal context. The Bellot-Mountjoy marriage comes from a world in London of family and work, in which marriage is carefully planned and executed, bringing together both lustful longing and financial strategy. Our next legal case comes from a set of ecclesiastical lawsuits, but tell us a good deal more about that world. They're cases of contested marriage contracts in which men and women sue each other to enforce a verbal promise of marriage. And that a steady stream of people used the courts, the church courts, in this way to enforce a marriage that one party was trying not to fulfill tells us already something about the role of law in the Elizabethan worldview. It was diverse, it was various, and it was well integrated into society. It offered a wide-ranging set of remedies. It helped build a household, and it helped keep a family together. It was against canon law to live apart after marriage without permission. Adultery and cruelty were grounds for separation, and all these things were readily witnessed in the shared households and the loosely divided rooms of 17th century London. The case we're going to hear about involves a man trying to in fact two men, trying to enforce a marriage contract made by a woman who seems to have contracted herself to both of them separately. Now, marriages, of course, happened in church, but a good part of them could also happen outside church. Marriage contracts could be made beforehand. And that exchange of words in a marriage contract, depending on its nature, could be more or less binding. It was on these verbal exchanges that litigation hung. And it's quite evident from the records that early modern women and men, including ordinary Londoners, knew exactly how those rules worked. A contract, then, bound you to marry somebody, either definitively or if certain conditions were followed. The essence of a contract was a promise of marriage, and you'd make it using the words of marriage. I take you for my lawful husband or wife. It required witnesses. It could involve gifts. It didn't have to have much more than that. If you make a contract in the words of the present tense, then you are effectively bound to marry that person. And if you have sex with them, then you effectively are married already. You can be taken as their husband and wife. If you make a contract in the future tense, saying, I will marry you, then you have to marry them, unless you add a condition. For example, if you say, I will marry you if my friends agree, then you only have to marry them if their friends agree. So there are various ways of making these quite complicated conditional contracts. All this adds something interesting to our knowledge of Shakespeare's world of courtship and marriage, not just the minutiae of marriage contract law, which many of Shakespeare's marriages draw on, but also the legal, the social, and the economic significance of the courtship period as a semi-formal public time in which families, neighbours, and friends, like Shakespeare himself, were involved in bringing people together and in witnessing, in becoming part of a marriage relationship. So this is a world in which the marital decision was often slow and thoughtful. Now, of course, amongst elite families, parents expected to have a strong say. But for the majority of Londoners, this wouldn't have been the case. And I think the two cases we're going to hear about here actually stand out a little bit for the important role that parents played. The vast majority of London marrying people didn't have their parents around. London is full of marriageable young people. Its population at the turn of the 17th century is disproportionately young, but very few of them had their parents anywhere around. Most of them were migrants. Both girls and boys were likely to be living away from home, in service or in apprenticeship. And most of them also married relatively late, in their mid or their late 20s. The people who married earlier were generally born in London, in fact, like Marie Mountjoy and the woman we're going to hear about in the next case. And they tended to marry a little bit earlier, and perhaps they had slightly different courtship patterns. The majority of marrying people also had already lost, by the time they married, at least one parent, and many would have had no parents left to accompany the process of courtship. And so the language of friends in marriage looms very large. Friends could be relatives, kin, lodgers in the house, or employers, or anyone with a financial or an emotional interest in the forthcoming union. So there's a sense of widespread financial and emotional investment in the whole process of marriage. And the 16th and 17th centuries also saw something of a backlash against parental influence in a marital process. English Protestantism, which did very little to alter traditional marriage law, nevertheless defined itself partly against malpractices identified with Catholic tyranny, as they saw it, and this included tyranny in the household. Fathers or mothers who pushed children into unwanted marriages, mismatched ones, particularly were excoriated in sermons and homilies and murder pamphlets. And more than one of these favourite stories of disaster featured a young woman forced to marry with an ugly old man. So the power of a mother, in the case we're going to hear about, draws on some powerful contemporary stereotypes. We're used to thinking of 17th century England as a strongly patriarchal society, and indeed it's the father in the Belloc Mountjoy case who looms large. But in the case we're going to hear, it's the mother. And in very many of the marriage contract cases which I've looked at in London, it's the mother who wields the most power. It's mothers who ban the suitors from the house, shut their daughters up, and threaten them if they won't marry who they want them to. One man in 1579 was reported to have told his lover that he was worried her mother would send her away and terrify her in such sort that she shall be forced to deny both me and your promise. Another mother testified that she had banned her daughter's suitor from the house because he was an apprentice. She would never give her consent that her daughter should be contracted with any man's apprentice. And a third mother allegedly said she would rather see her daughter buried alive than married with a man she had chosen for herself. So we might be seeing in these London cases a conflict between relatively independent young people in an urban environment and parents who expect to have a say. Whether or not parents were involved in it, litigation over marriage context provides some of our very richest evidence for love and marriage formation in Shakespeare's London. And one of these features is a rich language of love and emotion. If the will and Shakespeare's deposition are not what we would wish, depositions by other people absolutely are, even more than we would wish. The courtroom provides a place where people can be incredibly eloquent, and this is particularly true in 16th century cases. This case we're going to hear comes from the church courts rather than the court of requests, and it is a late 16th century case. The scribes at this point seem to be more writerly. They're more individual. They write more individual stories. They seem to be more dramatically engaging. I can only think that things have become a little more routine by the first quarter of the 17th century, when the press of business is higher and the habit of producing long depositions in English was more established. Nevertheless, depositions in the legal process are very much part of the warp and weft of contemporary popular culture, and popular pamphlets use legal records. They're often deliberately emotive. Church courts always place much stress on the spoken word. And listen in this coming case for a bit of evidence about how those stories might be produced for the court. It's not easy to tell whether what we're hearing is an authentic recall of a moment at which a contract was made, or a carefully crafted memory that was styled to fit in with the rules that everybody knew defined a binding contract. Our case also sheds light, I think, on the social lives of urban young people. Marie Mountjoy met her suitor in her father's house, but young women both in service and out had urban lives of a wide spatial reach. They worked in the front of shops, they ran errands, they lived in a mixed social world. One got betrothed when she was delivering clean laundry in 1610. Many got betrothed in alehouses or after dancing. One complained she couldn't remember what words she'd said to her suitor when they met outside and got betrothed, because there were so many people there. She was sore amazed at the so sudden meeting of so many persons in the highway. And of course, those people were people that her husband-to-be had encouraged to come to witness the contract. Private meetings, by contrast, was something of a sign of suspicion. But in the case coming up, we'll hear some censure of a woman's behaviour in the public street, an idea that the public display of emotion is slightly wrong, so there might be some interesting tensions there. We've already seen, I think, that the performative nature of legal depositions helps dramatise the moments of conflict and concord that they record. And this side of a court also allows witnesses and the clerks to almost act like producers recording stage directions. Physical familiarity is a strong proof of emotional commitment, but often in these cases it involves play rather than being explicitly sexual. Kissing was rarely mentioned, except in passing. It functions more like a sort of ceremonial ritual of trust. More common are descriptions of talking and toying, sitting on laps, using herself familiar with him, drinking out of the same cup. More playfully, one couple were recorded as throwing snow at each other. So courtship is deeply performative and public, and by its very nature it involves the display of affection and witnessing, and this process laid the basis for the very public nature of marriage in a city of crowded streets and busy highways and thin walls. What we're going to hear in the case that follows is a set of witness depositions. They're made in response to a set of questions posed by the plaintiff in the case, John Buckley, against the defendant, Agnes Modi, who he claims to be contracted to. So the witnesses, all the witnesses get to do is answer a set of questions. The questions are something like, were you there in September when such and such happened? And then the witnesses get to say, yes, I was, and this is this. So there's a varying amount of leeway for individuality.
John Modi of the parish of St. Sepulchre, without Newgate, joiner, where he has lived for 2 years and more. Born in Norfolk, aged 27, he has known John Buckley for 6 years and Agnes Modi for 10, respectively well. About the month of November, last past as far as I remember, John Buckley and Agnes Modi, resorting together to my house situated at Pye Corner, was there about that time together where, upon occasional certain words that they had privately between the two, one was angry with the other, so that John Buckley would have gone forth to his house, but she, Agnes Modi, and Rafi Kibley, being there also present, catched him by the gown to have him pulled him in again. But when he seemed to forsake his gown, they left off their hold, so John Buckley went then away, after whose departure she, the said Agnes, earnestly requested Ralph Kibley to fetch him thither again. And with much wailing and weeping and wringing of her hands, she said to them,
Now I perceive it is true indeed that hath been told me that he,
meaning the said John Buckley,
is about to have another woman to his wife. But I have borne many a stripe and many a foul word for his sake, yet will I never forsake him. For I loved him long before that ever he loved me, and I am sure to him the way of matrimony. And for all the sorrow that ever I have had for him, yet will I not deny him, nor never have another husband but him. Neither shall I love any man so well as I do love him.
So, after that, the said Agnes Modi, and he, this deponent, going after John Buckley and Rafi Kilburn, who went to fetch the said John back again, met they two in the shambles, to which John Buckley, Agnes Modi, said,
John, what have I offended you that you would be so angry with me?
Have you, think you, given me no cause to be angry with you? For that I being before your mother, you denied that you were made sure of me in the way of matrimony. Yet once you gave me your faith and troth to take me to your husband, and I likewise gave you my faith and troth to take you to my wife.
Well then, I do confess that I did so indeed, and that I did deny it before my mother. But so will I never do again, neither for my mother, nor for any friend that I have.
and requested him to go back again to my house, saying,
I have certain things to say unto you both that I would not utter in the street.
and therewith, because he refused to go back with her, she wept grievously and cried out, so that divers going in the street bid her, for shame, hold her peace. Within a while after, John Bulkley and Agnes Mody meeting together again at my house, he said to her,
How say you, Agnes Mody? Will you be as good as your word?
Yea, by my troth, that will I.
How say you then, are you sure to me in matrimony?
Yea, that I am. And that will I never deny again while I live. And thereupon I have already given you my faith and troth.
Then said Ralph Kibley unto her, What, Agnes, do you mean to take John Bulkley, here present, to your husband? And she answered,
Yea, by my troth.
Sitting then on the said John Bulkley's lap, and thereupon she drank to him, and he pledged her. Then said my wife, then being present, and to her cousin Agnes,
Take heed, what you do is neither for a day nor a year.
That which I have now said I will never deny again for all the friends I have.
There being present and hearing me, my wife, Ralph Kibley, and Margaret Cole, as I remember. Besides but one time, I being present at Agnes Mody's mother's house, with her and her mother, heard Agnes Mody's mother so threaten her, the said Agnes Mody, her daughter, unless she would forsake and deny the said John Bulkley to be her husband, and said to her that unless she did so, she would never take her for her daughter, with divers other threatening words. But she, said the Agnes Mody, answered again, and said that she could not.
Mary Mody, wife of John Mody of the parish of St Sepulchre without Newgate, with whom she has lived as her husband for the last 3 years, born at Harrow-on-the-Hill, aged about 19. She has known John Bulkley well for half a year, and Agnes Mody for 10 years. It is as my husband said, and about a fortnight ago, I, with my husband, went with John Bulkley, Ralph Kibley, and divers other honest persons to the Angel in Islington, where we did eat certain cream, and the company paid for it, being about 12 pence. Neither me nor my husband paid anything. When we were riding home, Ralph Kibley bid us remember our answers, for the day of examination drew nigh. Margaret Cole, servant of Master John Roper of St Martin's, who has lived there for 3 years, born in Newcastle upon Tyne in Northumberland, aged about 19. She has known John Bulkley well for 2 years, and Agnes Mody well for 3 years respectively. Agnes Mody and I being familiarly acquainted together, by reason I did and doth dwell in the next house to her mother's house, did oftentimes accompany and meet together, and talk familiarly with the other, and especially within this 12-month, where and when the said Agnes Mody would tell me much of her secrets. So, amongst our often and sundry meetings and talking together a little after Hallowmas last past, as I remember, Agnes Mody talking with me on a time told me, amongst other talk,
I was made sure unto John Bulkley in matrimony in my mother's house upon the stairs, there. And that there I had given unto him my troth to be his wife, and he had given unto me his troth to be my husband, between us two only. And afterwards it came to my mother's hearing and knowledge, who would not consent thereunto, but was very angry therewith, after she knew it, and did therefore beat me very often times, and did evil use me therefore, so that I had ever since an evil life with my mother, so much that I was glad to deny my mother that assurance, afore by me made to John Bulkley, or else I should never lead a good life with my mother.
as she said. Wherefore, she said she was very desirous to talk with John Bulkley thereabouts, and told this deponent that she would desire me one day to go with her to hear what John Bulkley would say thereunto. So, about a month after that, as I remembers, she did indeed request me to go with her to her cousin John Mody's house at Pye Corner, where, she said, she would meet with John Bulkley. We went, and did there meet with John Bulkley, John Mody, his wife, and Ralph Kibley, who came in within a while after. And there Agnes Mody and John Bulkley having certain talk and occasion together that I heard not well, but as I think, it was about their assurance of Agnes' denial thereof to her mother. They two fell out together in words so much that John Bulkley would not tarry any longer there, but
flung away, although Ralph Kibley and Agnes Mody did earnestly request him to tarry, and plucked him by the gown to tarry. So after his departure, Agnes Mody lamented much, and weepingly said,
I never loved man so well as I did him, and do you not see how he loveth me? Well, many a sore stripe have I had for his sake, but yet will I never forsake him whiles I do live.
with many other words, sounding to the like effect that I can't now remember. So after that, the said Agnes Mody and I went homewards, and by the way in the shambles, met the said John Buckley and Ralph Kibley, again which John Buckley and Agnes Mody did a certain while their talk togethers in the street. But what their talk was I cannot tell, for I did not well hear it. But they appointed to meet the next day, and afterwards they went home. And the next night, after the said Agnes Mody desired me again to go with her to her cousin John Mody's house at Pye Corner, with whom, I again went, whereafter there came in John Buckley and Ralph Kibley, unto which Agnes Mody, John Buckley said,
How say you, Agnes? Are you the same woman you were?
Yea, by my troth am I.
Then said he again to her, holding her by the hand,
How say ye, Agnes? Are ye not sure unto me in matrimony? And have you not already given me your troth to be my wife, and I, you, my troth, to be your husband?
Yea, that I have.
Why did you then deny it to your mother?
So will I never do again for my mother, nor all my friends that I have.
Then he, setting her on his lap, said,
Shall I then take witness thereof now?
Yea, by my troth, for I do mind to stand to it, and never again to deny it whiles I live for damning of my own soul.
and thereupon he kissed her, and had much talk together that I now remember not. All the witnesses there being present and hearing as aforesaid. Divers times since, Agnes Mody, talking to me, told me that her mother would not consent that she should marry John Buckley, but, quoth she,
I shall never fancy man so well as I do him while I live. I am a better the day I do see him, and I am sure to him.
and Agnes Mody's mother, sending for me to talk with her, I did come unto her, and talking with her about this matter, because I did utter the truth unto her, and what I heard both Agnes Mody and John Buckley confess and say, she did give me a box on the ear, and said unto me that if her daughter ever had John Buckley, I should repent it, and that her daughter should never have penny or halfpenny of her purse, neither would she take her for her daughter, if ever she had John Buckley.
On the material of John Harrison, Hugo Cotgrave, alias Richmond, herald, parish of St. Vidas in Gutter Lane, who has lived there for 14 years. Born in Lichfield in Staffordshire, aged 44, he has known John Harrison for a quarter of a year, Agnes Mody for 12 years, and he does not know John Buckley, well, except by sight. About 2 months ago, as I remember, I, being acquainted with young John Harrison and understanding that he was a suitor in the way of matrimony unto Agnes Mody, was requested by him to come to his brother's house to supper, where I should meet with Agnes Mody and her friends, at whose request he came thither to sup, where he met with Mr. Audley, Francis Morgan, Mistress Mody, Agnes Mody, her daughter, and divers others, where after supper the said Mr. Audley declared the occasion of their meeting, and afterwards asked the said young John Harrison and Agnes Mody, there present, if they were free from all former contracts, and was content to be joined together in matrimony, who both answered yea. Then said Mr. Audley, willed John Harrison to take Agnes Mody by the hand, and to say after him, who did so, and said after Mr. Audley to her in effect, as followeth. I, John, take thee, Agnes, to my wife, and do forsake all other women for thee, and thereupon I give you my troth. And thereafter, Agnes, taking John Harrison by the hand, said to him after the said Mr. Audley in effect as followeth, as much as he can remember.
I, Agnes, take thee, John, to my husband, and do forsake all other men for you, and thereupon I give you my troth.
And in effect made a perfect contract together, one to the other, as I remember, which done, one kissed the other. and the company there present bid God give them joy together. I, understanding that John Buckley did resort to Mistress Mody's house to her daughter, did thereupon once talk with him thereabouts, and willed him, if he had anything to say to Agnes Mody, he should come to her mother and utter it. And thereupon I came to Mistress Mody's house after him, and talked with Agnes Mody and her mother about the same matter, and asked Agnes Mody if she ever had made with him any promise, and Agnes denied it utterly, and said, never in her life, nor would not without her mother's goodwill. Mistress Mody did put Agnes Mody at my house in Gutter Lane, where she was about 3 or 4 days, because she could not make John Buckley forbear, resorting to her house.
John Buckley, personal response. To the allegations, I respond that I do not believe them. For about this time, 12-month, as I remember, the said Agnes Mody, then being free from all men, did contract herself willingly and simply to me. Then I likewise, being free from all women in matrimony, did faithfully promise to take me to her husband. And I likewise then promised her to take her to my wife. And upon that we each often did plight our faith and troth to the other. So ever since then, Agnes hath been reputed my wife. And Agnes hath confessed the same before divers witnesses divers times since then, so that Agnes hath made any contract since that time to the said John Harrison, or any other person, it is of no effect, as I believe, because she was not since that time of her contract made to me, free from all men, but assured and pre-contracted to me, as is aforesaid.
Thank you very much to our speakers, our wonderful speakers and our wonderful actors for bringing those scenes to life for us. I'm going to now invite Laura and Lena to join us up on the stage, if that's all right, so that we can have a round table. And in fact, if you wouldn't mind moving up, sorry, that would be wonderful, so we can all squeeze on. So, because we have relatively limited time for the round table, what I'm going to do is open it up to the floor immediately, and then if I have time to ask the questions I'm burning to ask, I will do so as well, but I'll give you all the chance first. So we have a roving mic. Would anyone like to ask a question? Farah in the front row. Oh, thank you.
Yes, I have a question for Laura, actually. My understanding was that marriages couldn't happen without the consent of the father. So I was really surprised to hear what you were saying about the experience of most Londoners. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. That completely changes the way I see things.
Most people are marrying at an age when the consent doesn't, they're over the age of consent. They're well over 21, right. So they don't need to see. What they may need is the financial investment of their parents if they're still alive. Okay. But many of them will have already inherited anything that they're going to inherit.
Yeah. Gosh, that's fascinating.
Any other questions or thoughts or comments? Thank you, over here.
I was just wondering, how did Mountjoy versus Bellot actually end? What was decided?
It was kind of a hung jury. What happened was the Court of Request decided, these people are French Huguenots. Really, this should be decided by the French Church. Over to you. So they went through all the taking of the complaint and the response and all the witnesses, and then they couldn't reach an agreement, apparently, and they sent it to the French Church. And the Church basically allowed a certain amount of money to Stephen Bellot, but not nearly as much as he had asked for.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Bridget. Oh, you're welcome to shout out if you'd rather, and I can... So, who got Agnes?
They put it in a different book and lost it. But I think it probably would have been Buckley because he seems to be very clear. That seems to be very clearly the first contract. Harrison was the subsequent one.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you all. In both these cases, this is a very sort of broad outside view. Is there a sense of sort of two worlds colliding? A lot of the confusion seems to come from a different understanding of more modern sort of codified ways of understanding things, whether that's money, monetary value, or marriage in certain forms of contract. An older way is sort of a misreading of whether how much goods amount to in terms of value, or whether sort of just things said back and forth are quite the same. Sort of, if you think about the sort of the £60, the £200, these pledges versus the stuff and goods that Shakespeare doesn't know about, and then at the same time the sort of the idea of actually just being married in a church before proper witnesses and everything. I don't know if there's anything in this, but people seem confused about two ways of being almost.
Well, I think that also obtains with Farah's question, because of course it used to be the case that parental permission had been more frequently required. I mean, there are big shifts happening in terms of how these contracts are taking place, I think, and so we are kind of caught between two worlds.
And that's probably particularly true in London, where you have so many overlapping communities where possibly the Mountjoys function in a world which may be shaped by more Huguenot customs. Belloc is coming from a different background, and then they're also coming into contact with equity law, dealing with the issue of exactly what the apprentice should have got, and whether or not his friend should have provided his clothes and all that stuff. But on the other hand, these people in London pretty soon get the idea that there is a whole range of overlapping jurisdictions that you have to deal with, and they're very astute about drawing on different bodies of law and custom for different things.
Thank you. And I'm going to jump in now, if I may, because I can't restrain myself any longer. I was just going to ask both Lena and Laura if you'd mind commenting on how you found the experience of seeing these records that you know so intimately in performance, and did it change the way you looked at them at all, or did it confirm things you already thought about them as performative texts?
I'm really grateful to Emma. I actually saw Emma do a similar performance this summer, I think it was. It's wonderful to see these documents come to life. And it actually bore out my own reading of the Mountjoy case. Again, if you've read Charles Nichols, he comes down pretty hard on the side of Ballat. He thinks that Mountjoy is... there are a lot of problems with Mountjoy and Mountjoy's behavior, according to Nichols. When I read the cases, it seems to me that there's a little bit of truth in this story and there's a little bit of truth in that story. And it's not all the case where one is right and one is wrong. But you'll read one bit and think, oh, but that makes sense. And I think that's probably accurate, and it will seem to be borne out. The very interesting fact, for example, that although it's not really a main part of the case, the question about whether or not Mountjoy actually provided clothing to Ballat when he was an apprentice, which enters into it. And there are kind of more sophisticated readings of what was going on with that, with the provision of apparel in some of the other depositions. So hearing the depositions voiced by people who were presenting them as the honest, or presenting them as the testimony, embodying the testimony, really brought that out more, I think, in terms of the fact that there's something accurate in each of the statements. And that's why it made this case so complicated, and why it probably was that the Court of Request punted on it.
And for me, I'm finding it extraordinarily powerful seeing the stories in the court reenacted by convincing actors, because I can never quite believe how good they are, actually. And there are lots of cases like this, and to see them acted, it does show how convincing the stories in the cases are. And that's what's really important about a story in court. Not that it's true, but that it's convincing, that the judge is able to say, that's a convincing story, and therefore I can grant a sentence that confirms this claim. And you see you see a little bit of how those stories might be put together and how people might practice it beforehand, but we also know that depositions were practiced before the case went to court. People would have talked about them. So for me, it sort of almost really reinforces my belief in the importance of narrative and legally related narratives in daily life, and just how much practice people had in telling good stories about the stuff that really mattered to them.
Thank you. So in terms of both telling good stories about things that really matter to them, and in terms of this some note of truth and some true details in each of the depositions that have conflicting versions of events, I'm going to turn to the actors now and ask if any of you would like to comment on your experience of working with these texts that are in some way unfamiliar to you, but that do have such storytelling potential and that do require you to decide where your character that you're embodying stands on the various conflicting versions of the same story that you're telling.
Sure. I mean, it's a lot to get your tongue around, but it is fascinating, really. I think there's a lot to be said for people genuinely seeing things from a different point of view. You sort of think, in the Belloc case, there's this young man who sort of latched onto the fact that he might get certain money at certain times, and I feel like he possibly has less understanding of the way things work, and then, you know, your master points out, yeah, but maybe I clothed you and fed you all this time, and if you think about it, and all these little things that sort of add up. And then your mind starts to sort of spiral off about the relationship with the daughter. Maybe he took a shine to her, and the master notices and says, oh, you know what, it might work out. And how that could be misread, you start to sort of imagine all the various ways that might come apart, and then how it might look different in a court of law, trying to actually remember the sequence. It's fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, so it makes you super alert to the places where those misunderstandings can happen, or those imagining of what took place can kind of conflict with other people's recordings of it. Yes, George.
I was going to say as well, although the language is in some senses archaic and a bit, you know, old, it's actually very punchy. You know, there's a real force to it, and I suppose it's what you were saying about people have to make their story heard in court. They have to make themselves believe. They have to be storytellers, and it's funny performing it because you feel the real sort of power behind the argument, and the way the arguments are laid out in a way which perhaps with sort of modern language we don't often use so much. We don't sort of drive, and all the language throughout the whole thing is just constantly driving, which I think gives it a certain dramatic quality, even though it's obviously not written to be a play.
So yeah, thank you for kind of spelling out the ways that these non-dramatic texts can actually work in performance because of the drama inherent in them. So we should probably draw to a close very soon, but would anyone like another quick question or thought or comment, or just to say who you thought won in the Belloc Mountjoy case, who was right? Oh, question at the back. Thank you.
This is just a comment. It sounds like William Shakespeare suffered from diplomatic amnesia.
Definitely, yes. I think there was something we very much came up against, this question of how much he's sort of sitting on the fence and therefore being careful not to come down on one side or another. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, one of the things that Nichols throws out at one point was, was Shakespeare losing his memory? Was he somehow failing? But no, it's perfectly clear, it seems to me, that this is diplomatic or political, and that he's being careful not to come down too hard on one side or another. And I think that goes back to something also that we were saying before about narratives and about what happens in these court cases. You read them and you think, or hearing them today made me think how difficult it would be to think that anybody could ever reach an accord, that anything could come out just as a consequence of people deciding to agree, because in a court system that's built strictly on people reporting in, strictly on people's words, you see how people get more and more committed to the story they're telling. And as you get committed, how is it going to be possible for you to back down? Shakespeare was one person who was not as committed in this, and it shows in his deposition because he's very careful not to be too strong on either side.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that's a lovely note to end on, bringing it back to Shakespeare and to what we can or can't glean from these sources about him. So thank you very much again to our speakers and to our actors, and thank you for being such a lovely audience. Thank you.